People struggle with the most asked interview question: tell me about yourself. Keep watching and we'll teach you how to answer this question so they want to hire you on the spot.
You're hired.
This question is going to be asked in any job you apply to. Why? Because the first step usually in whatever job application is the recruiter screen. And they're going to ask you this question as one of the first questions to assess whether your past experiences match with the job description. Because this is where they filter out people that are not a good fit. So a lot of people ask me, well, do I share a play-by-play of my professional career from when I started in college to my first job, to my second job, my third job, my 10th job? Do I tell them about my hobbies? Do I tell them about my life story? This might be hard to hear. I'm gonna let you in on a secret because I like you. But it's not really about you. 3 things I'm gonna cover in this video. First, the secret to nailing the tell me about yourself question. Secondly, I'm gonna share a framework that's gonna be a template like fill in the blanks to make it easy for you. And third, we're gonna talk through some examples. So let's dive in. First, the secret to nailing this question. You gotta reframe how you think about this question. So when they say tell me about yourself, you should realize what they're really asking is tell me about yourself so I can figure out if you're a good fit for this role and our company. They're basically gonna compare you next to what they're hiring for. So when you're talking to them about your life, in their back of their mind, they're thinking, okay, I know what I want, and I'm constantly looking to see what you have to offer and whether it matches with what they want. So for the tell me yourself question, most career gurus forget the first step in this question. You want to go figure out what the heck they're looking for, whether it's through the job description or asking the recruiter directly. Let me share my hack how I do this to make sure I personalize my answer to not just the company, but each individual that's interviewing me. When I get into an interview a couple minutes in, I would say something like, I've read the job description front and back, but I'd be curious what your perspective is in what this role is looking for. And their response helps me in the back of my mind to then personalize my response around what they say that they want. So again, it's not totally about you, but you relative to what the company is looking for. And hence, your tell me about yourself response, it should be a 2 to 3 minute teaser that piques the interviewer's curiosity to then want to deep dive with you and ask you other questions about your experience. You should also briefly comb through your resume, because don't assume that the interviewer coming in has read your resume. Most times than not, they don't, because they're busy going into meetings and they probably didn't even know they had an interview today until 5 minutes ago. But do not go through your entire resume. A lot of career gurus will tell you, start from your earliest experience and how that maps to your current experience. No, especially if you've had more than 3 jobs. Hiring managers don't want a play-by-play of your experience from when you were 8 and I started coding, and then when I went to college I studied computer science. Then my first job was a software engineer, which led me to my second job, and then I hated my third job, so it took me to my 4th job. No. So if that's not what they want to hear, then let's go through what they do want to hear. So let's jump into the framework. So the first step in the framework is the overview. And here you want to cover the role that you're currently in and the length of time you've been in that role. For example, starting off with, I've been a product manager for 5 years. So this is simple, right? I told you this was going to be a fill in the blank. Here are some caveats. If you're interviewing for a role and you haven't been in that role for too long, you might skip calling out how many years you've been in that role. And I'll tell you why a little bit later. Or if your current role isn't in the same function as the role that you're applying to, you might not even mention the role that you're currently in. So why did I say those 2 things? Because sometimes if you have little years of experience or you're not in the role that you're interviewing for, some interviewers might be biased in the back of their mind, some unconscious bias to think like, oh, this person's like super junior, or this person's applying for the wrong role, especially if they're interviewing people that already have that role. And hence, you want them to assess you fairly based on the work that you've done and not the title or how many years you've been there. So this isn't necessarily lying or leaving out information. They can find all of that on your resume. The second part of the overview, you want to talk about the companies you've worked at and the domains. You want to start off with your most current employer, not your first employer. Why? Because where you're working at now is probably more relevant to the job than where you were working 5 years ago. If your company name is easily recognizable, you want to mention it alongside the domain. So for example, I worked at Google building products for AI and machine learning. So there, Google's the company and the domain is AI and machine learning. So yeah, I mentioned I was gonna explain what domain means. You can talk about the industry like retail, finance, fashion, or you can talk about topics and spaces. Like I mentioned, AI, machine learning. You can talk about hardware. Those are to clue in the interviewer on the domains that you've worked in. And it really helps because sometimes they might be willing to hire you even if you haven't done that specific role, but you have the domain expertise. For example, a lot of investment banking people go into working at tech startups and they make the leap into tech by first joining a fintech company because they understand finance. So what do you do if your company's name isn't super recognizable? Then you might skip the company name altogether and just mention the domains. For example, I worked at a company focused on retail and finance as a software engineer. And why do we omit the name here? Because if the name of the company isn't recognizable, then you saying it isn't going to add much value. Versus if you just mention the domain, where the interviewer is like, okay, interesting. You're applying for a fintech company, you're in finance, makes sense. So let me give you an example encompassing of all the things that we just talked about from the framework. So I've been a product manager for 5 years now, and I'm currently at Google building products for AI and machine learning. Prior to Google, I worked at a startup focused on retail, and then prior to that, I was at Chase Bank working in finance and investment banking. You see here I mentioned the retail startup without mentioning the name because it's not easily recognizable. Now version 2, this is if you've worked at companies where the name isn't the most well known and hence you're mostly using the domain. And this is also the case if you haven't been in the role that you're applying for too long. I'm currently developing AI and machine learning products and tools for developers. Before, I worked at a startup focused on retail, and prior to that, I worked at a large bank on investment banking. Why don't we put this into practice? And I'd love for you to take the template that I just showed you and comment below, and let's kick off that 1 to 2 sentence to get a head start on the tell me about yourself question. Beyond the overview, you want to cover core skills and what you did on the job and the impact that you've had. And your first duty here is to show them that you've done what they're hiring for. So maybe talk about 3 to 5 skills that they're hiring for. For example, if the company is hiring for a product manager, then you'll want to talk about all the times that you've done strategy work or launching a product or talking to customers. And again, you want to start with your most current employer, not your first, because your most current employer, you're probably doing work there that is most applicable to what they're hiring for. And here, you don't want to use the same 3 to 5 skills for every employer that you talk about, but instead, if you're going to mention a second employer, talk about core skills there that wasn't mentioned for the first employer, so that they end up being complementary rather than repetitive. Other reasons where you might mention another company is if there's something that you were especially proud of that you accomplished. Maybe at a company you helped drive a $10 million revenue increase. That's definitely something you want to mention. Next, you want to mention the scope of what you worked on. And here it's to reflect complexity and the difficulty of the challenges that you had. For example, you might say something like, led a 50 people team with a $500 million budget. And lastly, you'll want to talk about the impact that you had at these companies, either quantitative or qualitative. And this is to show that you've delivered sizable impact. Companies want to hire people who are driving and impacting business outcomes, not just doing the job. For example, I led the strategy and execution for a 50-person organization where we built a new product line that contributed $50 million in annual recurring revenue. So do you see in this last example where we highlighted the core skill, which is strategy and execution? We talked about the scope, which is the 50 people team, And then we talked about the impact, which is creating a new product line, and the $50 million ARR, annual recurring revenue. By the way, in a future video, I'm thinking about covering other commonly asked questions, maybe like, tell me about a weakness. Why don't you comment below and let me know what are some common interview questions that you'd like me to cover in more depth. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss when that video hits. And the third part of what you want to cover, and probably one of the most important parts, and relates to the message we shared at the start of the video, is why are you a good fit? And because this section is so important, I might actually advise that you address it explicitly and say something like, well, because this role is looking for strategy work, I think I'm a good fit based on my past experience working in management consulting, where I've created strategy for the Fortune 100 companies. Or you might say, this role is a good fit because I'm extremely passionate about creating strategy for large companies. If you think those two are a bit braggadocious or come off a bit too arrogant, you might want to go with something a bit more implicit. You can try the method of mentioning key words in the core skills section or this last section. For example, if a company is looking for people who can work in a fast-paced environment, then at the end you might say something like, at these companies that I just mentioned, I've worked in very fast-paced environments with really tight deadlines and we're able to deliver the results and more. Or you might say something like, well, I'm very interested in this role because there's a fast-paced culture, which I've shown to have thrived in before. Now I'm going to mention this last section, which is totally optional. But here I would say be personable. After all, we're all human beings where we do things that we enjoy outside of our work. And a lot of career gurus tell you to avoid this section. But I would say this section is so crucial to connecting with the interviewer and being memorable. For example, you can share a fun fact that makes it easy for them to remember you out of all the people they've interviewed. For example, my go-to at the end of the interview to show that I love traveling is telling interviewers, oh, I've gone to 95 countries. Or you can talk about hobbies of yours that are easily relatable. For example, traveling, cooking, sports. These are things that are going to invite the interviewer in to maybe ask you a question or also let you know that they also are obsessed with badminton. And that's actually for real. If any of you guys are obsessed with badminton, let me know because I play a whole heck of a lot of badminton. And see, now you're going to remember this fun fact about me. So this can sound something like, outside of work, you can find me playing badminton. Or, beyond my day job, I love hiking and I've even climbed Mount Everest. And I mentioned this section is optional, but it is such a great way to connect with the interviewer on a human level. So a couple things that I want you to remember. First is be intentional. Basically, I mentioned this question is not necessarily about you, but you relative to what they're looking for. So if you want to be strategic in answering this question right, there's definitely a right way to answer, though there is no right answer. You want to convey what fits what the hiring manager is looking for. Of course, that's also aligned with what you care about, because you don't want to be inauthentic. For example, if someone is hiring for a cryptocurrency product, you want to talk up your finance experience and not so much need to mention your retail experience. And the second thing I want you to remember is to be structured in your response. So again, a tell me about yourself question isn't supposed to be you telling me your life story or a ramble. But start from the 100,000 foot level. And here we mentioned talking about how many years you've been in the role, the companies you've been in, and then go down to the 10,000 feet level, which is talking about the core skills that you've done and why you're a good fit for this role based on your experience. Think of it as an onion. You're peeling layer by layer. And also in your response, make sure to pause so that it doesn't come off like a soliloquy. Oh, I also forgot to mention how long each of these sections should take. So in the overview section, should be no more than around 2 sentences, so that's about 30 seconds. In the meteor section, where you're covering your core skills, that can be up to a minute or a minute-ish. And then the section on why you're a good fit should be anywhere from 30 seconds to 45 seconds, which is about 1 to 2 sentences. And then the last section of be personable should be maybe 15 seconds. It's a 1-sentence thing mention. So again, your response should be no more than 2 to 3 minutes. Realize this is just the first question in the interview. They're most likely going to ask you other questions like, tell me about a time you dealt with a conflict, or tell me about a time you were given negative feedback. So take a look at this video where I actually share a structure for you to answer behavioral questions just like that. I will see you guys in the next video.